There is a reason you are hearing this message right now, and it is not an accident that you found your way here. Something has shifted, and even if you cannot fully name it yet, you have already felt it somewhere deeper than thought. It is not something that changed in them. It is something that changed in you, quietly, almost invisibly, like a current moving beneath still water. And whether they have the words for it or not, a part of them has already sensed that shift more clearly than you realize. Before we go any further, there is something you need to hear, something that may contradict what you have been telling yourself. What you have been feeling in this connection is not your imagination. You're not being overly sensitive, and you are not creating meaning where there is none. In fact, the most difficult part of this experience is not the intensity of what you feel, but the isolation of it, the sense that you are the only one who can see what is actually happening beneath the surface. You may have experienced moments where they pulled you close only to become distant again without explanation. Moments where their words felt warm, but their energy felt cold. Moments where you questioned your own perception because nothing was ever clear enough to confront directly. And perhaps the most confusing part of all is that whenever you begin to step back, whenever you begin to let go, they seem to reappear in subtle ways, as if something inside them refuses to fully release you. What you are experiencing is not random. It follows a pattern, one that Carl Jung might describe as a collision between persona and shadow. On the surface, people present a curated version of themselves, a mask designed to maintain stability, approval, and control. This mask, the persona, is not inherently false, but for some individuals, it becomes more than a social tool. It becomes a psychological shelter, a structure they hide inside because what lies beneath feels too chaotic, too painful, or too threatening to confront. And this is where your presence becomes significant, because you do not only interact with the persona, you sense the inconsistency between the mask and what is hidden behind it. You feel the tension in their voice, the contradiction in their behavior, the emotional residue that lingers even when everything appears calm. You might not say anything. You might remain silent, thinking that silence protects you. But silence does not hide perception. And on some level, they know that you can see what they are trying to conceal. This awareness creates discomfort in them, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your presence disrupts the illusion they rely on. Jung suggested that the unconscious communicates without words, that one psyche can affect another in ways that bypass conscious understanding. And so, even if you never confront them directly, they feel exposed around you, not logically, but instinctively. You may have tried to offer understanding, to gently reach toward what you sensed beneath their surface, expecting that this would create closeness. But instead of opening, they became defensive, distant, or even sharp. What you experienced as empathy, they experienced as intrusion. What you intended as connection, they interpreted as a threat to the structure that keeps their internal world stable. To them, your insight does not feel like safety. It feels like exposure. And this creates an unspoken tension that shapes everything that follows. At the beginning, however, it likely felt very different. There may have been an intensity between you that felt almost inevitable, as if something in them recognized something in you. This is not unusual for someone who lives behind a carefully maintained persona, your authenticity can feel like relief. Maintaining a mask requires constant effort, constant control, constant suppression. And when they encounter someone who is more connected to their inner world, someone who feels rather than performs, it creates a temporary sense of ease. They are drawn to that. They are drawn to you. But this attraction contains a paradox, because the same quality that draws them in eventually begins to destabilize them. Your presence does not remain neutral. It acts as a kind of psychological tuning force, stirring parts of them they have spent years avoiding. Without saying anything, without doing anything intentional, you begin to activate what they have kept buried. They may start to feel emotions they cannot explain: restlessness, irritation, unexpected sadness, or a vague sense of unease. These reactions seem disconnected from any clear cause, and because they cannot trace them back to their own internal state, they begin to associate them with you. This is where the shift begins. The discomfort does not immediately become resentment. At first, it is subtle, a slight tension in silence, a growing inability to relax around you, a need to fill space with distraction. You may notice that they avoid stillness, that they reach for their phone, turn on noise, or create movement whenever things become quiet. It is not boredom, it is avoidance, because in stillness, the parts of themselves they have suppressed begin to rise, and your presence intensifies that process. You, on the other hand, may feel confused because you are not doing anything. You are simply being present, simply existing in a way that is natural to you. But that is precisely what disrupts them. It is not your effort that creates the tension, it is your authenticity. This is where envy begins to take root. Not envy in the conventional sense of wanting what you have externally, but a deeper, more subtle form. They do not necessarily want your circumstances. They want what you represent. They want the internal coherence, the emotional access, the capacity to feel without collapsing or avoiding. And because they do not possess that within themselves, your presence becomes a mirror of what is missing. Jung spoke about the concept of the unlived life, the parts of a person that were never developed, never expressed, never allowed to exist. These parts do not disappear. They remain in the shadow, gathering weight over time. And when someone encounters another person who embodies those suppressed qualities, it creates a confrontation that is difficult to tolerate. You become that confrontation. At first, this may appear as admiration. They may idealize you, place you on a pedestal, or feel deeply drawn to your way of being. But admiration without integration cannot sustain itself, because over time, admiration turns into comparison, and comparison turns into discomfort, and eventually into resentment. This transition is rarely obvious. It does not arrive as open hostility. It emerges as subtle shifts in tone, in presence, in emotional availability. You begin to notice a lack of warmth where warmth once existed. Conversations become flatter. Responses become delayed or dismissive. There is a distance that cannot be explained by anything that has been said. You may share something meaningful, something that matters to you, expecting connection. And instead, you receive something minimal, something that acknowledges your words without engaging with them, not overtly cruel, but quietly cold. Or you may find yourself vulnerable, expressing pain, seeking comfort, and sensing that the response you receive is not truly connected to your experience. It is as if they are present physically but absent emotionally. This is not accidental. It is the manifestation of a deeper psychological process. The resentment they feel is not directed at what you do, but at what you are, because your existence highlights a disparity they cannot ignore. Every moment of your authenticity reflects their own disconnection. Every expression of your emotional depth reminds them of what they have suppressed. And rather than confronting that internal conflict, the psyche often chooses a different path. It begins to devalue the source of the discomfort. This is why you may notice subtle criticism directed at the very qualities that once attracted them to you. Your openness becomes naivety. Your intuition becomes irrationality. Your emotional depth becomes too much. These are not objective assessments. They are defensive reinterpretations designed to reduce the impact of what you represent. Because if they can redefine you as flawed, they no longer have to confront what your presence reveals. At the same time, another dynamic begins to emerge, one that is more difficult to recognize because it operates beneath conscious awareness. They begin to withhold, not dramatically, not in a way that can be easily named, but consistently enough to create a sense of absence. They withhold attention, validation, emotional presence. They engage just enough to maintain the connection, but not enough to nourish it. And this creates a psychological environment where you begin to compensate. You may find yourself explaining more, giving more, trying to restore the connection that once felt effortless. But the more you give, the less you receive. And the more this imbalance grows, the more confusion you feel, because it does not feel like a clear rejection. It feels like something unresolved, something incomplete. And that is exactly what keeps you there. What is happening is not a misunderstanding. It is a structural dynamic. They are attempting to regulate their internal state by controlling the level of connection between you. Too much closeness activates discomfort. Too much distance activates fear. So they move between the two, unconsciously maintaining a balance that allows them to avoid fully confronting either. But for you, this creates instability because you are engaging from a place of sincerity, expecting continuity, expecting alignment between words and actions. And when that alignment is missing, your system tries to make sense of it. You question yourself, you analyze, you try to find the point where something went wrong. But the truth is, nothing went wrong in the way you think. The dynamic was already present. It was simply not visible yet. And as this continues, the tension begins to solidify into something more persistent. Not just confusion, but a quiet erosion of emotional safety. You may begin to feel alone even when you're not alone. You may begin to doubt your own perception, wondering if you're misreading something that cannot be clearly defined. But what you are sensing is real. You are not imagining the distance. You are perceiving the shift before it is acknowledged. And this is where the next stage begins. As this dynamic deepens, something more complex begins to unfold, something Carl Jung described through the idea of the mirror. You are no longer just someone in their life. You become a reflection, not of how they want to see themselves, but of what they have avoided seeing. And this is where the tension intensifies in a way that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Most people surround themselves with reflections that confirm their identity. They choose environments, relationships, and narratives that reinforce the version of themselves they have constructed. But you do not function as a passive reflection. You do not simply validate the image they are trying to maintain. You reflect what is real, and more importantly, what is possible. When they look at you, they do not only see who you are, they see who they could have been. And that realization carries a weight that is difficult to bear. Jung spoke of the unlived life as something that does not disappear, but remains present within the psyche, waiting, unresolved. Every decision to avoid growth, every moment of choosing safety over truth leaves behind a trace. And when that trace encounters a living example of what was abandoned, it becomes activated. You are that activation. You may not be consciously trying to challenge them, but your way of being does it automatically. Your willingness to feel, to be present, to engage with reality rather than avoid it, becomes a silent contrast to their avoidance, and that contrast turns into pressure. At first, they may not understand what they are feeling, but over time, that pressure transforms into something more defined. Shame, not the kind of shame that comes from being judged by others, but the deeper kind that arises when a person confronts the gap between who they are and who they could have been. And because this feeling is so uncomfortable, the psyche looks for a way to escape it. It cannot eliminate the truth, so it tries to distort the source. This is when criticism becomes more direct. They begin to question your way of being, to minimize your experiences, to reframe your strengths as weaknesses. Not because those interpretations are accurate, but because they serve a psychological function. If they can convince themselves that you are flawed, then the reflection becomes less threatening. If the mirror is distorted, the image no longer has to be faced. You may notice that you begin to adjust yourself in response. You speak more carefully. You share less. You hold back parts of yourself that once felt natural to express, not because you have changed, but because you are trying to preserve the connection. But this creates another layer of tension, because even when you reduce yourself, the underlying dynamic does not disappear. Your presence still carries what it carries, and the reflection remains. This is why the relationship begins to feel paradoxical. They are drawn to you and disturbed by you at the same time. They need your presence and resist it simultaneously. And this contradiction does not resolve itself. It intensifies. At some point, another shift occurs, one that is less visible but deeply impactful. You begin to function as a source of energy for them. Jung used the term libido not only to describe desire, but the broader flow of psychological energy, the force that fuels emotion, creativity, and vitality. When a person disconnects from their inner world, that energy becomes restricted. It does not disappear, but it is no longer freely generated, and so they begin to seek it externally. You, because of your openness and emotional availability, become a natural source, not intentionally, not consciously, but functionally. They come to you when they are overwhelmed, when they need relief, when they need to process what they cannot hold alone, and you, being who you are, receive that. You listen, you absorb, you stabilize, and for a moment, they feel better. But this exchange is not balanced, because while they release their internal pressure, you absorb it, and over time, this creates a pattern where your energy is being used to regulate their internal state. this is not always obvious. It can appear as normal interaction, as conversation, as connection. But if you look closely, you may notice a pattern. They feel lighter after engaging with you. You feel heavier. This is the transfer. And here is where the paradox deepens even further. Because the more they rely on you for this energy, the more aware they become, consciously or not, of their dependence. And dependence, especially when unacknowledged, often leads to discomfort. No one wants to feel that they need something they cannot generate themselves. And so, instead of appreciating the source, the psyche begins to devalue it. They begin to reinterpret your giving not as strength, but as weakness. Your patience becomes something they take for granted. Your understanding becomes something they expect rather than respect. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you're no longer seen as a partner, but as a resource. And resources are not protected, they are used. This is why you may experience moments where they take from you emotionally and then distance themselves, as if nothing has happened. Moments where they release their stress into you and then withdraw, leaving you to process what remains. And when you begin to feel the weight of this, when you begin to react, to express the impact it has on you, something else occurs: projection. Jung described projection as the process by which individuals attribute to others what they cannot accept in themselves. And in this dynamic, projection becomes a central mechanism. They begin to assign to you the very qualities they are struggling with internally. If they feel unstable, you become too emotional. If they feel uncertain, you become confusing. If they feel overwhelmed, you become difficult. These labels do not originate from your behavior. They originate from their internal state. But because you are open, because you are willing to reflect and question yourself, these projections can begin to take hold. You may start to wonder if they are right. If perhaps you are too much, too intense, too complicated. And this is where the dynamic becomes most disorienting. Because not only are you carrying your own experience, you're also carrying what has been projected onto you. You're holding emotions that do not fully belong to you, trying to make sense of reactions that were never entirely yours. And in moments of conflict, this can escalate even further. They may provoke reactions in you, subtly or directly, pushing boundaries, dismissing your reality, invalidating your experience. And when you finally respond, when your system reaches a limit, they use that response as confirmation of the narrative they have created. See, you're the problem. But what is rarely acknowledged is what led to that reaction. This is what Jung referred to as projective identification, a process where not only are qualities projected, but interactions are shaped in a way that elicits those qualities in the other person. They do not just see you as reactive. They create conditions that make reaction inevitable. And when it happens, the roles reverse. They appear calm. You appear overwhelmed. They appear rational. You appear emotional. And in that moment, the narrative solidifies. But beneath that surface, something else is true. The emotional intensity you are experiencing is not only yours. It is the accumulation of what has been transferred, unprocessed, and returned to you in a distorted form. And this is why you leave these interactions feeling confused, heavy, and often questioning your own reality. Because you have been carrying more than your share. This is the point where many people try harder. They attempt to fix the dynamic, to explain more clearly, to adjust their behavior, believing that if they can just communicate better, things will resolve. But this is not a communication issue. It is a structural one. The dynamic is not sustained by misunderstanding. It is sustained by avoidance. And as long as one person avoids confronting their internal world, the other becomes the place where that avoidance is managed. You become the container. And this brings us to the most important realization. You cannot resolve a dynamic that depends on you carrying what does not belong to you. At some point, whether gradually or suddenly, something in you begins to recognize this. Not necessarily in words, but in feeling. A shift, a quiet refusal, a moment where you stop trying to make sense of what cannot be stabilized from your side. This is the moment everything begins to change, because the dynamic depended on your participation in a very specific way. Your openness, your willingness to absorb, your tendency to question yourself. And when that begins to shift, even slightly, the entire structure is affected. You may stop explaining. You may stop chasing clarity. You may stop trying to repair what keeps breaking. And in that stillness, something unfamiliar emerges. Space. Not emptiness, but space. Space where you're no longer filled with confusion, no longer pulled into constant analysis, no longer reacting to every fluctuation in their behavior, and this space does something unexpected. It reveals you to yourself. For the first time, your energy begins to return to you. The attention that was directed outward begins to turn inward. And with that, a different kind of awareness begins to form. You begin to see the dynamic not from within it, but from outside of it. And this is where clarity replaces confusion. You start to recognize patterns that once felt random. You begin to understand that what you experienced was not inconsistency, but a system. Not chaos, but a structure that you were placed inside. And with that recognition comes a decision. Not necessarily a dramatic one, not something that needs to be announced, but a quiet internal shift. You stop abandoning yourself to maintain something that cannot hold you. And this is the point where the focus changes. Because this was never only about them. It was about what in you was willing to stay, to adapt, to endure, even when something felt off. It was about your capacity to feel, to connect, to remain open. And those qualities are not weaknesses. They are strengths that were placed in a context that could not receive them properly. And when you remove them from that context, they do not diminish. They transform. You begin to set boundaries, not as a reaction, but as a recognition of what you deserve. You begin to trust your perception, not because it is always perfect, but because it is yours. And you begin to understand that connection without alignment is not connection, it is confusion. So the question is no longer why they behave the way they do. The question becomes, what do you do with what you now see? Because awareness changes responsibility. Once you see the dynamic clearly, you can no longer unknow it. And from that point forward, every choice you make is informed by that awareness. You are no longer the person who waits to be chosen. You are the person who chooses, not from reaction, not from fear, but from understanding. And that changes everything, because the moment you stop trying to fit inside a structure that diminishes you, you step into something else entirely. You step into yourself. And from there, the dynamic either transforms or it ends. But either way, you are no longer lost inside it. You are no longer trying to survive it. You have moved beyond it. And that is where your power returns.